Hello and welcome back to our preaching masterclass. In these current segments we're considering what I'm calling the 7 deadly sins that preachers can commit. And we're asking the question, what can make a sermon or a talk in church go seriously wrong? And I find this a little embarrassing to talk about because to some extent I have to confess I've committed them all. Now, in our last segment, we thought about preaching for too long, the number one preaching misdemeanour that was reported by my unscientific straw poll among my friends. The second one that came up frequently was simply being dull. If preaching too long is the wordmonger, then this is about the bore. This deadly sin is less easy to resolve than the first one. So let's ask ourselves, what makes a sermon, or any talk come to that, uninteresting? Now, some factors are obvious, and a monotonous voice is one of them, speaking all at one level. The human voice is made for variety, and our minds are predisposed to listening to input that has an array of different tones. That diversity helps us to concentrate and to keep focused on what is being said. So how might I know if I'm speaking monotonously from the platform? Well, an honest friend is really helpful here. Someone who will give you a bit of feedback and you don't mind hearing it from them. So too is listening to yourself on a recording and asking the question, would my attention be held by what I'm hearing? It's a salutary question, but always worth asking. Not only is speaking at one level a way of sounding dull, another one is being too quiet, using a voice that doesn't have enough welly to reach the back of the room, say. Now, when I've mentioned this, I do hear people say to me, but I'm speaking through a microphone, so my voice is going to carry. But that isn't necessarily the case. An indistinct or monotonous voice is not improved just by virtue of being louder. It's much better to give the person on the sound desk, assuming there is one, it's much better to give the person on the sound desk more sound so that he or she can turn you down a bit rather than less sound, because however talented a sound engineer you've got, they can't invent sound you don't give them. And in my straw poll, I also discovered some other factors which contribute to dullness. Several people reported too many long words or Christian jargon. And this is surprisingly common among preachers and for some very understandable reasons. Those of us who have been trained in theology, and that's wonderful, I include myself in that number, have had our vocabulary extended by our theological study. However, in this process, most of us have accreted to ourselves a collection of words that we know and love and understand well. And because we understand them, we can slip into assuming that everybody does. I heard a sermon recently on one of Jesus' parables. And the preacher said, let's think about this verse eschatologically. And what he said was correct. We should think about that verse in the light of the end times, in other words, eschatologically. But I'm pretty sure he left 95% of his audience baffled by what he was actually saying. Certainly the people I spoke to didn't follow it. We can't assume that the average person in the average congregation grasps theological buzzwords, even though we may be using them correctly and they may be inspiring to us. Indeed, even words like salvation and repentance and atonement now need unpacking. Actually, I think they always have done. This is not a new thing. And we should do this because good communication is always receiver focused. So we need to use the word set of the people to whom we are speaking as far as humanly possible. And interestingly, the New Testament writers did that in their writing. Now, my straw poll also told me that we can become dull when there is insufficient relevance. If what a preacher says doesn't connect with some aspect of life, then he or she is showing they live in a mental world detached from the reality of their audience. Now, Okay, I am well aware that some preachers sacrifice the power of the gospel for the sake of contemporary relevance, and that's another topic entirely. But if we're going to avoid being dull, we have to carry our listeners with us and find connections in their lives for that word from God that we're imparting on that day. And I find it helpful to ask, is there a so what clause to what I'm saying here? And if there is, then say it, make it clear. And if there isn't, ask whether I should be using that sentence or paragraph anyway. We can also be dull by being note-bound. Back in 1967, Albert Mehrabian and Susan Ferris studied interpersonal communication and attempted to apportion weightings to the impacts of body language, tone of voice and words when we talk to each other. Their conclusions were that 55% of the impact of the message comes from body language, 38% of it comes from tone of voice, and a paltry 7% from the semantic value of the words that we use. Now, this is an often quoted statistic, and you might well have heard it before, but we need to be very careful how we apply it. Their study was done under laboratory conditions, and those conditions were completely different from the average church. However, although the precise numbers almost certainly don't apply in a church context, the overall principle does. Body language and tone of voice really matter, and probably matter much more than we realise, and paying personal attention to them will help us to grasp and retain the interest of our hearers. If I speak a truth in a disinterested tone of voice, the people listening will instinctively conclude that I'm not interested in it myself and begin to page out. And then we can also be dull by lacking personal passion. So to be interesting and worthy of people listening to us, we need to show that we're personally committed to the message ourselves. After all, when I preach, I'm asking people to believe me in the first instance. So if I communicate in a way that casts doubt on whether I believe it, those seeds of doubt will subtly be sown in the minds of the people listening to me. David Hume was a well-known Scottish philosopher and historian in the 18th century. He was also a deist who didn't believe in any inspirational relevance of the Bible or in the Son of God. But it's reported that on one occasion he thought it worthwhile to get up very early and travel 20 miles, a long way in those days, to hear George Whitefield preach. At about 5 o'clock one morning he was going down a street in London. He came round a corner to meet someone else who knew him and said, "Why aren't you, what?" And said, "Aren't you David Hume?" He said, "Yes." "Well, where are you going at this early hour?" "I'm going to hear George Whitefield preach," replied Hume. "But you don't believe a word that Whitefield preaches," said the man. "No," said Hume, "but he does." There was something about Whitefield's passion that attracted him. Why did Jesus need to perform a miracle of feeding 5,000 people from a small boy's lunch? Because such a large crowd had remained riveted by his preaching, he felt the need to provide for them. Jesus must have been an inspiring and compelling person to listen to. He was a passionate communicator. And great preachers are always people who are passionate about their message. You know, there was a catchphrase from the Welsh revival that ran like this, and it's my rule of thumb for avoiding being dull. Get on fire for God, and the world will turn out to see what's burning. Well, that's enough for this segment. Join me on the next one to think about some more deadly sins of preachers. God bless you. Well, from here, you can like, you can subscribe, and you can share what you've just seen with some of your friends. So please do click around on the screen here, and you'll find some other things that I hope will help to bolster your ministry. You could be anywhere in the world right now, but you're right here, and I appreciate that enormously. God bless you.